Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Randy Belt with the Atlantic Council. It's great that you're all here this afternoon, right after lunch. We want to make this a dynamic discussion to keep us all awake because many of us have traveled long distances and have just eaten, so that's why we're doing these smaller discussions right now. This is a conversation on the geopolitical implications of potential peak in oil demand. I don't think anyone here is going to tell you that they think oil demand is going to peak in 2030 or 2035 or whenever or if ever, but if it were to happen, what that might mean for geopolitics. RJ is drafting a paper on this topic for the Atlantic Council, and we wanted to have it here today, but we basically have been on the road for the past 6 months, so it's not quite ready yet. But this discussion will probably inform some of the things you write about. We're going to get started first with Axel, who is going to do a little bit of an overview. So the first slides.
So good afternoon. So my presentation will be more about economics of peak oil demand. It will be a short presentation. So first, what do we know about the future of oil demand? So this is not okay. So here we have plotted the various, most of the scenarios that have been published by institutions or companies regarding the future of oil demand. So you have until now the historical demand, and then you have all the scenarios where you see that the future is largely uncertain. So here you have the scenarios from the Energy Information Administration, the International Energy Agency, the IEJ, ExxonMobil, BP, and others. Of course, they differ mainly based on the assumptions regarding the speed of the energy transition. The red line below shows the production of oil. How would the production of oil evolve if you have no new investment based on the natural decline of the producing assets? So you see that future is uncertain, but there is a need for a lot of investment for new oil producing assets. So now, I was wondering, okay, this tells us about future demand, but what about future oil revenue? Which is probably what people are interested in. What is a pie to share? So most of these organizations publish scenarios where they have prices consistent with their demand scenarios. So, but some scenarios do not publish prices, okay? Just demand forecast. So here we have fewer scenarios, but we have taken the scenarios we know. We have multiplied every year the demand by the world oil price in this scenario. Of course, there is some interpolation because many scenarios give an oil price, let's say, every 5 years only until 2014, not every year. But anyway, so, and this gives us how these institutions see in terms of global oil revenue for the future. It's very rough because it assumes that all the oil and even some associated liquids in oil equivalent are sold at the international oil price. We don't care about quality here, but at the end, it shows that yes, there is uncertainty, but if you compare to all the history, we did the same exercise until 2017, I guess, or 18, where we multiply the supply demand by the price in 2017 dollars. We see that it's not so bad when we look at it. Now there is uncertainty. So who will produce the oil in the future? And I think a fundamental question is what can an oil exporting country do to hedge against this future, which remains uncertain, but of course there is necessity to hedge. And so here we give the OPEC market share until 2040 and the US oil, total US oil production market share until 2030. So the horizontal bar for give you the market share for every year, so you have to read it horizontally. It's not very intuitive, but it shows that the US title production is expected to plateau over the next decade, and after 2025, then the OPEC market share will increase again. And this percentage of market share come from the world oil outlook from OPEC and the world energy outlook from the International Energy Agency. So, and both see that low-cost producers will see an increase in their market share. So the question is, probably if you have an oil exporting country, you want to first secure some future demand for your product. So a way of doing it is to invest in some market segment whose growth will remain robust, like petrochemical. Petrochemical products demand is less sensitive to climate policy than fuel transportation demand. You want to probably invest in joint venture with local companies in countries where demand growth for oil will remain robust. Also, we talk here about low-cost oil, but especially in this region, you have producers which are very low greenhouse gas content per barrel produced. I'm talking about the production of oil. And so this might be a comparative advantage for customers who want to buy oil with a low carbon footprint. Now, the second thing that you can do is to lessen the dependence of your economy to the oil revenue. You can do it in the short term with oil revenue funds, but here we are more focusing on the long term with the role that sovereign wealth fund wants to can play, but the ultimate prize is the economic diversification. So how do you develop sectors and make your economy, and especially your economic growth, less dependent on the oil price? And there have been a certain number of, okay, so I have just the last slide. I don't know why it's not showing. Can we put the last slide? Yeah, so you had a certain number of policy response in the region. So not just because of the uncertainty regarding future oil demand, but also for other reasons like job creation and for instance, the Vision 2030 in Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much for your attention.
Axel, thank you very much. Axel, thank you. Everybody has some slides, but I actually want to go through and ask a quick question of each of you before we do the next presentation. And maybe, and it's an opportunity for one or two questions if they're tied to what I'm about to ask. And we'll just go down the line from Chris, RJ, Yukari, Axel. What do you think the drivers that would cause a peak in demand are, and what are countervailing drivers that might prevent a peak? And I hope that you guys disagree, just so that it's more interesting.
We never agree.
Yeah. So I think there are three key drivers that are going to impact or accelerate peak demand or determine when peak demand happens. First of all is regulatory. Actually, in no particular order, actually, and you'll see this in one of my charts. One is regulatory, one is technology, and one is consumers. All three of those have to behave in certain ways in which to influence that. Technology, to a certain extent, requires an economic rent to be able to compete. So we talk about low energy prices today are making some of the technologies harder to succeed, but we've also been in a period of strong economic growth, which means there are more investment dollars. Regulatory environment sometimes can accelerate, but usually has unintended consequences, and often a heavily regulated environment also has a negative impact on GDP. And finally, the consumer. The consumer has to want to adopt the change, and sometimes even when it's economic, sometimes there is a lot of stickiness in existing ways of doing things. So each of those three things have to work together, in my mind, for you actually to have a meaningful, speedy energy transition. Those will be the key drivers.
RJ?
Per your request, I'll answer the question in a different way, which is, I'll say a country, which is China. I think that what the Chinese are doing, we heard a little bit about that this morning, in all three of the areas, technology, consumer, regulatory, is quite significant given China's importance to future oil demand growth. And if their successful process, the 3 phases of energy transition that was mentioned by the speaker this morning from the NDRC, that will be the key really to success for peak demand globally, given how important China is to future oil demand. Now, having said that, and I am pretty optimistic about a demand peak in China, probably earlier than other countries, I think it will be very difficult to replicate in other parts of Asia, especially developing Asia, that may lack some of the same policy mechanisms in India, Southeast Asia, some of the same resources to deploy to transition towards clean transport, and therefore will take a lot longer.
Grab that
one. We actually published a report on the potential or possibility of oil peak demand 2 years ago, 1 year ago, and then our conclusion is that even if we assume that 100% of the new sales of the vehicles, all the vehicles, including trucks and buses, by 2050 will be 100% of the zero-emission vehicles, including fuel cell cars and then the plug-in hybrid, then we actually may see the peak oil demand in 2030. But that assumes that each and every part of the world will follow that picture. And then, so the key is that whether or not the developing economies, which is supposed to have more and more demand for the transport, will follow that kind of policy or regulation or whatever the consumers' the preference to make that happen. Otherwise, the peak won't happen. Because currently already the developing economies have already reached the peak. The demand for oil in this area is already going down. So what we have to change is actually this trend in the developing world. Ironically, I would like to add one driver which may bring the peak oil demand. That is actually the passive attitude from the oil producers or oil producing countries or oil companies in investing in upstream. Because if that peak will happen, by 2050, the level of oil demand will be lower than 2030, but then it is actually the same level as the current level, meaning we need the upstream investment. So if that upstream investment doesn't happen, the oil price will go up, and then that will discourage the consuming countries, and then that will actually accelerate to introduce more and more electric vehicles, so on and so forth.
Axel.
Thank you. I think we already had a very detailed picture. I mean, I think that also an important factor that will drive the shape of future oil demand is future economic growth, regionally and globally. And we know little about this, especially when we look over the next 2 or 3 decades.
Does anybody have any questions on this? Here we go.
Thank you, Cornelia Meyer from Meyer Resources. And my question goes to Monsieur Pierru. And it is, I'm fully with you that if you invest in petrochemicals, it seems that there's a more assured demand growth there than in other parts. However, is that still the case? Because if I look at all the movement against plastic, against this, against the other, isn't there? It's really sort of gathering momentum, and not just in the developed world, also in the developing world. Does that not mean that we will also see a little bit of demand destruction, tapering of demand potentially on the plastics front?
I mean, first, I must thank you for the question. I mean, I understand your point. So I think that the view that chemical product, petrochemical product will be, a strong, will know a strong demand, a growth in demand. I think is a mainstream view. I even read, in the Financial Times recently that some increase in electrical vehicles penetration order would have would require new materials or lighter material like plastics, and would have even a positive impact on demand for the feedstock for chemicals. So in this sense, investing in petrochemicals seems a good hedge against this uncertain future. Yeah, I don't know if my colleague has something. Yeah. Oh, you have your.
I'm actually going to stand because those chairs are so comfortable that. So why don't you guys move in a little bit closer, and I'll do the rest standing up, and then you can easier to pass the microphones. Yeah. Yeah. Chris, you always like to be the center of attention.
I can see you now as well. I think just to that question, I mean, I think the piece around the oceans and plastic is getting a lot of headlines, but the reality is it's a very small percentage of the total use of plastics. I think you made the point very well, Axel, is the fact that the future of electric vehicles is going to be lightweighting. The safer they are, the lighter they become, the more plastics you can use in those vehicles. If you look at the planes, if you look at Solar Endeavour, the first solar plane to fly around the world, it was made 98% out of plastics. Construction, you can make steel beams out of plastic, same strength. You're building skyscrapers out of plastic. You have two benefits there. You're now transporting very lightweight materials instead of steel around the world for construction, but you're also sequestering carbon at the same time. So I think we've got to be very careful about how we look at the chemicals industry. I think it's both a saviour as well as a threat, and we've got to look at the single-use plastics. We need to deal with those, and then think about actually how we use plastics in an effective and responsible way, which actually will be beneficial to the planet.
Chris, thank you. That's really great. Let's get RJ's presentation because it ties into this. So we'll get that presentation up right now. Robert Johnston, yeah.
Always known as RJ.
Yeah, RJ, while we're waiting, Oh, there we go. I was going to ask you
All right.
something personal, but we'll wait for that later.
All right,
Go ahead.
Intriguing. Let's see if I can make this work. Dramatic pause.
There we go.
I thought I would start with the same slide as Axel just for fun. But no, I like my headline though. I wanted to make sure I didn't waste this, which is the more I talk to my clients who are investors and folks in the oil industry, I'm hearing less about the old 3P, the proven, probable, and potential, and more about the peaks, plateaus, and pathways. And I think that the very fact we're having this panel, suggests that the focus on the energy transition is really gaining ground. But as Axel pointed out, no one really knows where this is headed. And there's a lot of churn and a lot of confusion, I would say, and uncertainty and misinformation about the longer term world demand forecast. And it used to be something that we energy economists and geopolitical things would talk about, but now it's really capturing the market attention, as I want to show here in a second. Next slide. So I would say the current peak demand debate is sort of divided into two areas. On the financial investor side, the asset managers, the hedge funds, the banks, those who are providing capital, a lot of them believe the peak demand is happening very soon. They believe a 2-degree scenario, they believe the faster transition scenario, and that is reflected in the fact that they're preferring the shorter cycle shale assets over the longer cycle, riskier deep water, oil sands, conventional onshore assets. Part of it's about the 2-degree scenario and ESG type investing, and some of it is simple concern about longer term stranded asset risk in a peak demand world. By contrast, my clients who are actually in the E&P sector or super majors think the exact opposite, right? That they think that the real problem is a supply gap, not a demand gap, and that we've underinvested in the upstream, and we're setting up, as Yamashita said, for a potential shock of higher prices due to lack of investment. But the key differences between investors and industry, in my opinion, is that the investors are probably excessively optimistic about the role of policy and regulation in accelerating peak demand, and industry is probably excessively pessimistic, right? Meaning that the policy will never happen, it's too politically difficult, and it's not relevant. So that's what I think explains this big difference that we're seeing. And governments, from my perspective, notwithstanding Vision 2030 and a few other programs in this area, are not paying enough attention to this yet. So just to give you a sense of the differences, a lot of our clients, especially European investors, believe in the 2-degree scenario here, which is the light blue bars, right, which suggests that by 2040, we're going to be burning 18 million barrels a day less crude than we are today. I don't believe that personally. I don't think probably anyone on the panel does. But people who control billions of dollars of assets and invest in are believing this. There's no question about it. I think industry is probably closer to where Exxon is, not surprisingly, right? That maybe the demand shock is 2, 3, 4 million barrels a day, right? That's sort of a pretty big difference. Now, if you look at the valuations for the higher cost, longer cycle producers, I think the more negative sort of stranded asset scenarios are what you're seeing, among other things, of course. So, I'm a geopolitical guy, that's what Eurasia Group does. If the investor side is right, and we do get to peak demand, what are the geopolitical implications? So our hypothesis is that somewhat in line with what Axel said, that the countries that would be most affected by peak demand are the oil producers that have weak political institutions, meaning they have a very limited ability to manage an external macro shock or to manage potential economic downturns. And the countries that also have high production costs. And if you have both of those things, then you're really in trouble. Why? Because those investors are not likely to provide capital. And countries, these types of countries often have very small to non-existent domestic capital markets, are entirely dependent on foreign investment and would therefore be challenged in these scenarios. So to put it on our chart here, what we did at Eurasia Group is look at countries' dependence on oil revenue as a percentage of GDP, and then what we call political capacity, right, which is the strength of government and their ability to handle external macroeconomic shocks. And you can see here, one other way to phrase this question is, which country is the next Venezuela, right? Venezuela, as we know, has already gone through a shock, and obviously lower oil prices are making it worse, along with a sharp decline in production. And of all these countries, major oil producers, which ones are most vulnerable? We believe that the countries that have stronger political institutions, according to our models, such as those UAE, Saudi Arabia, etc., will do better, and the countries that have less strong political capacity, like Nigeria in particular, is a good candidate to be on that list where Venezuela is, if we do get to a peak demand scenario. So a couple other geopolitical thoughts I'll throw out there before I relinquish the microphone. First of all, I think that there's a couple of things we could talk about with Russia, right? Well, what about Russia? Russia under Putin we think has pretty strong political capacity, but we're not sure what happens after Putin. And if that combined with peak demand, what would that mean? And how would that impact Russian foreign policy? What about OPEC? I'm just sort of throwing topics out here for consideration. OPEC is sort of already bifurcating into the haves and have-nots, right? And I think you all know what I'm talking about. And I think that would potentially accelerate even more where the core group of OPEC producers are making the big decisions, have capital, have spare capacity, have investment, whereas the more marginal producers are becoming even more marginal. And that could have some geopolitical implications as well. What about resource nationalism? I think in a scenario of a slower peak or a more distant peak, resource nationalism, reverse resource nationalism, meaning governments offering more incentives for foreign investment would be important. But I would argue that in a faster transition, it probably won't matter, right? You can't really offer enough incentives to turn around those more aggressive scenarios where we're dropping 20 million barrels a day over the next 15 or 20 years. Axel also mentioned new trading and strategic relationships. I totally agree that the relationship between here in the Gulf and Asia will be even more critical, right? Because as mentioned, we've already sort of moved to a peak in the OECD world, Europe, North America, etc. And those commercial partnerships with the Asian downstream in particular will take on more geopolitical importance as well in the future. And then lastly, I think we need to think about the new geopolitics of energy, which renewable energy, which I know a lot of people are working on, and thinking about those supply chains as well and how they support electric vehicles with strategic minerals and maybe create new types of geopolitics to consider as well. So hopefully I threw a few thoughts out there for discussion, and I will turn it back to you, Randy. Thank you.
RJ, I have a quick question for you before I go to the audience. You mentioned that the investor community is perhaps overreacting to the prospect of a peak in oil demand. Along the lines of what Yamashita said earlier, could that be a self-fulfilling prophecy that there just isn't? If there's not enough investment, you'll ultimately cause a spike in prices, which will.
Sure. It just comes to a question of whether or not this is just a normal cycle, meaning that the market is moving as a herd and is misreading where we are in the cycle, which happens to happen many times in the past, or if there has been a structural shift towards a view that oil is at a greater risk of becoming a stranded asset in some of these scenarios. I would say that in this cycle, more investors, not necessarily all of them, of course, believe that the stranded asset risk is real, and that does create, in my view, a greater risk that we do have underfunding, right? If you look at the US shale getting 75-80% of global upstream spending, right, that means a lot of other parts of the world are not getting development. Here in UAE or in Saudi Arabia, it can be funded locally, but other parts of the world, I think, are seeing underinvestment, and that creates the risk that you're talking about.
That's great. Does anybody from the audience have any questions directly for RJ? Great. Yes, Ali, right up in the front. Here we go.
Just to build on, so it's Ali Al-Janabi from Shell. So we've clearly got a scenario ourselves of which we looked at last year we launched, which is the Sky scenario. But more just going back to the point of passive investments. You touched upon the investor's view on short cycle, but I think what's, and building on the point when the reaction from the populace, we are seeing a lot more, so some of the investors are now questioning whether they should continue to invest in oil stocks. So that then has a reaction by the oil majors and some of the smaller companies of what they can and cannot do and what the outlook is going to look like. So maybe just building on what is another reason why potentially investments would probably slow down in oil is that the reaction from the investors, for example, BlackRock, what Larry came out with last year, the beginning of last year, saying, a lot more of a stronger stance on greenhouse gas emissions and so on.
No, I completely agree, and that's definitely what I'm driving at, right, is that the transmission belt between institutional investors to the boards of the publicly traded E&P and super major companies, and then into their capex, right? Especially in Europe with Shell and BP and others, increasingly in the US. And again, the question is that sort of normal cycle, and I think no, it's not because of what you said about Larry Fink and BlackRock, right? BlackRock is not an ESG investor; they're a large mainstream asset manager, and they're at least reducing in part their exposure to long cycle oil and gas because of the risk of peak demand, not because of any kind of focus on climate or anything like that. That's maybe part of it, but from a risk perspective, they want to reduce their exposure. And maybe it's more perception than reality, but it's still driving a change in behavior.
Any of you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of focus on this concern about the international companies not investing enough. But I mean, even when we look at Shell, some of the investments there, they're getting a lot more oil for a lot less dollars, $30 a barrel break-even plateau in deep water, bringing on a project that used to take 7 years to bring it on 2.5, 3 years. So in fact, what's interesting is, yes, the long cycle project is now out of favour. It is all moved to short cycle, whether you're looking at renewables, whether you're looking at gas, whether you're looking at oil. But what technology is doing, we heard about the impact of digitalisation. It is enabling us to put 2 wells down to the same field, get more oil out. We're finding bigger fields, so we don't need to explore as much. If you look at the fields that are being discovered, they are mega fields with more oil. So you may see less FIDs, but for each FID, there's actually more oil being produced. So don't ever bet against technology. We want to think we want technology is going to win in the renewables. It's also going to win in fossil fuels and conventional, and that's what we're seeing. So I don't see this worry about lack of investment at the moment. There are some very good projects coming on, and we don't need as many, and they can come on a lot faster than they used to. Of course, Shell's the big game changer there, but there's plenty of other examples.
But when you say we don't need as many, right, we don't need as many projects to get the same amount of oil, not that we don't need as many because we don't need the oil. That's an important difference.
Yeah. We're getting more oil. We're getting much more oil out of each reservoir, and we're getting it faster. So I think the bigger issue potentially is that we're depleting some of these reservoirs at a faster rate because we're learning how to use enhanced oil recovery, and that may be masking a little bit of what the true decline rates are. I think that is probably the bigger issue right now. I don't think there's an issue about availability of oil.
Axel has a question. Well, he's asking, pull up Chris Midgley's slides, please.
Actually, Is there a chance you can put up a slide that Arjun had?
Sorry.
On the slide you had the projections on on decrease in oil demand because of electrification. A piece of data that I found last year, which blew my mind, I don't know if you are aware of this, about 350,000 electric buses in China caused a decline of oil demand by 280,000 barrels. If you look at 2025, even in the 2-degree scenario, that's just about what reduction we've already seen in 2018. So could there be a chance that we're underestimating electrification?
Absolutely. That's why I said my 3 Ps, right? Peaks, plateaus, and pathways. I think the people in this panel, all of us could find a pathway towards the 2-degree scenario. The question is the technology, the policy, the consumer, as we discussed at the beginning. But absolutely, it is achievable. There are pathways, and that's why it's so interesting. I think another relevant example in the transportation sector is U.S. ethanol, right? That when the ethanol mandate came in 2005, everyone said, okay, well, by 2020, we're going to wipe out 1.5 million barrels a day of gasoline demand. Well, here we are. I mean, it has happened, right? Versus a business as usual case. So these things can happen. The question to me comes down to, as a political scientist, I'm biased more towards the political drivers, other people are more biased towards technology and markets. But yeah, there are a lot of those cases that could build up into the pathway that you're saying.
Great. Let's go to Christmas slides now.
Okay, so once I came up, I wasn't quite sure where the conversation was going to go, so I thought it would really mess with everyone's minds and throw lots of other ideas here, assuming that there are some slides going to come up. And I was going to start off with really talking about, indeed,
press it again.
there we go. I was going to start with just thinking about, first of all, how the energy system has become much more interconnected than it ever has before. So today we talk about, obviously, conventional fossil fuel, which is ancient plant life, but today, this is difficult. Okay, but today, modern plant life is competing. So thanks for that segue, RJ. We see much more biofuels. A very strong sugarcane production in India has resulted in very low ethanol prices, which has displaced a lot of gasoline in Brazil last year. That had a massive impact on demand for crude, not demand for fossil, not demand for oil, but demand for crude. So there is another factor. Of course, when we think about how we're generating electricity, generating energy, we have a new mix. We've got solar and we've got wind, but of course that's intermittent. And with that intermittency, we now need to manage that. We're trying to manage that much more with battery storage. And at the end of the supply chain, the consumer is moving to a much more electrified economy. We've heard a bit about that. But the question is, well, is that sustainable? Sorry. I have to be patient here with this clicker. So there's a number of trends that I see that are happening here which we need to understand. So first of all, there is this electrification. That's creating a huge demand for electricity, but a lot of that electricity is intermittent. So we have to then think about how can we use some of that surplus energy in a different way. We heard Lisa Davis talking about PTX, power to X, power to liquids. We're going to have to see how you can use power in a different way to create store energy density. Of course, at the moment, we're looking at batteries, but batteries are going to require lots of metals. We bring a new geopolitical issue there in the fact that we're going to need cobalt. We don't have good solutions for batteries that don't use cobalt. By 2030, we'll only have 25 years of cobalt left. So this idea of electrification of transportation creates a whole new problem, a whole new geopolitical risk, unless we can find alternative solutions. And of course, car manufacturers are investing most of their money about how do you make batteries without cobalt, because they see that issue emerging. So transportation is not just about electric vehicles. We have to start thinking about alternatives. The amount of battery metals we need is huge if we want to electrify the whole transport system. We're going to have to find alternative solutions. Of course, there's going to be this drive towards renewables, but of course the circular economy, the recycled, we've heard about the plastics, will be another trend. Energy efficiency is going to have to play its role. But again, as we heard from Ernie Moniz, I thought was great, which we went to the slide, we are not going to achieve this without some form of carbon capture. Today we think carbon price is the way to do it. Carbon price is an extremely inefficient way of driving decarbonisation, and as Ernie talked about this morning, in fact what we need to do is have methods in which drive investment. And so that's why when I look at the energy transition, which then links back to the geopolitical, I've touched on the fact that this is driven by governments, industry and consumers in the form of how technology, regulation and consumer behaviour works. Today, each of those operate, in my mind, on the periphery of those Venn diagrams. The regulation is done independent without thinking about the consequences. So you get subsidisation of electric vehicles. What is that doing? It's effectively subsidising the rich versus subsidisation of scrapping old vehicles, which would be a more effective way of decarbonising, which actually puts money into the less wealthy people in the economy. Technology is still requiring price and wealth and growth to be able to develop, and eventually some of the dollars will run out in that area unless we continue to sustain a high level of GDP growth. And consumers, for all we talk about consumers and millennials caring about the planet, the reality is they care about convenience. The success of Uber is because you don't have to walk the mile to the station or the mile to the bus station. You can just get from A to B conveniently. That is adding huge amounts of miles to the amount of that we use cars just through Uberization or rideshare. If I look at, therefore, the worlds that we have to think about, we will not, on there on the left, you can see it's dictated by 4 different areas. Each of them has an impact on GDP growth or of the rate of energy transition. Today, a lot of the world is in a consumerization world. Low energy prices has driven high consumption, but that does not help to drive the energy transition. High GDP growth does mean you have more technology investment. Technology investment will help us move to energy transition. But at the same time, we're now moving into a protectionist world. We know where that's coming from. And that, of course, slows down wealth in the economy. That's why we're worrying about it today. And, of course, also leads to inefficiencies in supply chains, less energy transition, versus regulation, which tends to put pressure on GDP growth, but can accelerate the energy transition. The only one you really want to be is the top right quadrant, but it's a very hard quadrant to get into. So you think about Germany or California, places like that, they put a lot of regulation on, but all they've done is ended up with the highest energy prices, which impacts consumers. You cannot do that unless you're a very wealthy country or state. You try doing that in Africa or Latin America, it just simply doesn't work. So we don't have a clear solution of how we get, and we will move through those different worlds. And maybe I'm not allowed any more slides. I'm not going to touch this slide, but these are just the outlooks that we have at Platts. What it recognises, I think the key here is, until 2030, there's very little difference in the demand for oil. Oil really gets impacted in a 2-degree world, which I think I agree with RJ is a very difficult world to get into, but one which we must continue to aspire to. Then you start to get the rapid deceleration. And this is why the industry does need to continue to invest, because the danger is if it doesn't, we end up with high oil prices, and then we'll certainly have that cliff edge. But why doesn't it happen quicker? It's because there is a lot of demand stickiness in the market. Let me just try. And as you can see from this chart, what we see is that, yes, we will see cars getting to peak demand by 2025, 2030. That will happen. Most of that will not come from electric vehicles. It will come from the efficiency of new internal combustion engines. That is driving it. It's the retirement of the old, inefficient fleet. Yet at the same time, trucks and buses will continue to grow. The point that was well made about China and electric buses, they consume a tiny fraction of what commercial goods consume. It's the commercial trucks, it's the long-distance buses, which you cannot electrify. And therefore we need different solutions. So even with this, we've put a huge amount of displacement in cities on electric buses, but it has very little impact on total consumption. I'm just going to jump to a couple of, if this thing lets me. That's it. Just keep going forward. And I'll just keep going forward because I'm going to just miss out a few slides. Keep going. Keep going. So this one just is about is battery metals. I'm not going to touch on it, but what it basically shows there, if I could build it up properly, the NCA is basically the Tesla battery. You can see how little cobalt it has. You can see the drive today is to try and get cobalt out of there. Why? If you just move on to the next slide, I'll give up using the clicker. Just keep going. It'll just go to the next slide. Just go to the next slide. Here you can see that the demand for cobalt, by 2030, if you look at these projections, we'll only have 25 years of cobalt left. Now, it seems that there should be enough time to develop battery technology, but battery technology has not developed. It takes a long, long time to develop. And so, therefore, electrification of transport could have very detrimental effects. The next slide just puts a little bit of context into that, which shows that if 25% of all cars in the US change to EVs, you need a lot of battery capacity. Whereas if you converted 25% of homes to have batteries for storage, you need a fraction of that, and you're going to be able to utilize the energy, the intermittent energy, much more effectively. And as a result of that, I was really pleased to hear Ernie Moniz talk about my next slide, which is really where is the ideal solution? Well, we need to move to solve this intermittency, and that's hydrogen. Hydrogen with transportation doesn't make sense, so we just built to the last slide. Hydrogen where you can actually affordably, just click one more, produce the hydrogen at a retail site. You tell me a retail site that doesn't have water and electricity, you can basically produce hydrogen there. So the hydrogen economy starts to become a key enabler, and if we go too far with electric vehicles, we create a whole new problem, both from a mining perspective, a metals perspective, and a sustainability perspective.
Chris, thank you. I want to make sure that Yamashita-san has a chance to talk, particularly because the work that IEJ Pedenshi has done on the geopolitics of potential peak in oil demand is really remarkable, and some of the best work that I've seen on how a potential peak could impact various countries, particularly countries in this region. So let's go to the final presentation.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I flew in last night like at 2 o'clock, and then I received the email at 5 o'clock and then talk about this. So I sent the slides just this morning. So hopefully I remember what I'm supposed to talk about. This is actually the outcome of the 1 year ago report which I mentioned. So I hope I don't have a clicker. Please, next slide, please. So this is what I was talking about. The overall oil demand in the reference scenario looks like that in the blue line on the left-hand side. But then if you assume that the 100% of the new car sold in the market by 2050, including trucks and buses, will be achieved with some different, the slow increase in the percentage share of these vehicles along the way, then we may see 2030 the peak. And then it comes from the fact that the red line, the developing countries to see the peak oil. And then that actually assumes a heavy assumption that the 100% trucks and buses and then the vehicles, all of them are electrified in terms of sales. So by 2050. So next slide, please. But then if that peak comes around at 2030, what will be the situation for the oil producers? This is a little complicated slide, but the blue bars are the reference scenario case, the supply they assume to supply. And then they are regional basis, so the left-hand side is the Middle East or other OPEC countries, and then North America, the former Soviet Union, Latin America, Asia. So you can see that all the countries or regions will be supplying less oil by 2050. So all the bars, green bars, are less than the blue line. But then if you look at the transition over time for each different regions, you see the growing the bars only for the Middle East. All the rest of the suppliers will see the decreasing supply quantity in the oil peak demand case. why is that? It is because in our assumption, because we are using the econometric model, we have to assume. So it's an expert judgment, but by 2050, the oil price will go down from 120 to about $50 per barrel. This is the opposite of what I have just mentioned earlier. But if the demand goes down, then we expect the market to react, and then the oil price will go down in the lower oil demand world. So who will survive in this lower oil price world is actually Middle East, which will be able to produce oil at a lower cost. Next slide, please. And yet, everybody, the oil suppliers, will suffer in this new world. On the right-hand side, this is actually the percentage, changing the net oil export against the nominal GDP in the percentage share to show that who have the negative impact. On the right-hand side, the Middle East, the former Soviet Union, and Latin America, they all suffered, Canada as well, with a negative impact. And then on the left-hand side bars, which are over plus, they are the importers who will benefit from the lower priced and then less import of oil. So the value they pay for the oil will be much less than now, than the reference case, sorry. And then on the left-hand side, so what will cause that? The upper side is the Middle East, all these net exporters. So how much of that negative impact will come from the price or quantity? And quantity actually is a smaller portion, like an orange line, but the price effect will be very, very harsh. And then altogether, they will all have the negative impact on the GDP. And then that is actually what I was saying. If the oil producers or companies are too pessimistic that the oil demand peak will happen very soon, they will refrain from the investing on the upper stream, and then eventually the oil consumers will refrain from using oil and then invest more on transiting out from the internal combustion engine or etc. to refrain from use of oil, foreseeing that there will be a shortage of oil. Then it will actually eventually affect the overall situation that so the oil peak demand will be created, partly because of the passive or pessimistic view of the oil investor. So what is important is a time frame. So we foresee that energy transition will happen in the longer term. We have to make it happen. And yet it won't happen in a decade. I don't think that nobody is agreeing that it will happen by 2030. Even the IEA, I think, I'm not sure that you have studied the IEA's the outlook, and then the BP says also the same. It is more effective if you look into the internal combustion engine and make it more fuel efficient. But at the same time, if we see that in the longer term, if we need to transit, then of course the oil producers, oil producing companies have to find or come up with a good strategy to transit away from the fossil fuel economy towards the non-fossil economy, and then make their fossil fuels not stranded. There comes the hydrogen society. The hydrogen can be very, very good option in the future. We start by looking into the CCS option. You produce the fossil fuel, but take out the CO2 and then put it under the ground, do the CCS, and export your fossil fuel resources in the form of hydrogen without carbon. It is called carbon-free hydrogen. If that technology is established and then the market is established, you need a huge market for that to happen and the cost to be down. Then you can also look into the green hydrogen, which is actually to generate and produce hydrogen from the renewables and then export or trade. And of course, it is also possible that you do that locally, the distributed way, and count on each vehicles to become the virtual power plant, so that all these cars and the things you have in a household can bring the extra power back to the store the extra power in the household and then utilize it when it's necessary. So the problem of the intermittency of a power supply will be also addressed in that distant future where the hydrogen economy becomes available. So we should not limit ourselves that we have to give up the oil and then we have to switch to electric vehicles immediately. No, it's not the way. So what I said at the very beginning is that we should have the longer term vision and then commit ourselves to which way we are going and then keep the alternatives in place. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. I have a question. This slide has fascinated me. Can we go back to this? This slide has fascinated me since I first saw it. And question for you on it. Just imagine you're looking at it with the bars with China and here we go. China, Japan, India, Europe, etc., doing better economically in this situation. Does that take into account the potential for, say, China or Japan to become a leader in new technologies? So is there an assumption in there that, say, China becomes the electric vehicle manufacturer of the world because they're so far ahead, and so they actually have an not just a gain because they're no longer importing oil, but then they're exporting even more. Is that part of the thought, or?
This is not a scenario. We don't count that into our estimation. It is simply that if we, if our new car sales will be shifted to the zero emission vehicles, meaning that that will be the demand, the size of the demand of that country in the reference scenario matters. Therefore, the huge amount that China will be big, but India is the biggest to benefit from that.
Okay, so I've been told that we can go to 3:15, so we have about 10 minutes. So a good opportunity for questions. So who has some questions here? I will keep asking them. Okay, I'm going to keep asking questions. So RJ, you have talked about this slide as well, and you alluded to that in some of your work about who's going to be the next Venezuela. I'm wondering if you could talk through this and what you think the actual implications are for sort of geopolitical stability.
Well, one question for my
Here.
One question for my economist friends here is, I do wonder with that lower oil price and the strong economic growth you already have in India and ASEAN, right? Will that sort of kick in, and drive oil demand back up and prices back up? That's sort of that elasticity. That's an interesting question, right, to consider. But as far as the geopolitics go, we have a slightly different view. It sounds like we all agree about the Middle East, at least this part of the Middle East, in terms of the high political capacity, low-cost oil producers that will do well in the peak oil demand scenario. I think other countries in the region with weaker political capacity will not do as well. Where we disagree a little bit, Yamashita-san, is that I think U.S. shale will still do well, right? So I think that number one, I think the cost will come down over time to some degree. I think that their ability to attract capital, given the low political risk and short cycle nature of the resource, will mean that they probably will do better in peak demand than some of the other regions here that you show, FSU, Latin America, Africa in particular, that agree, they no question have low costs, but when you add in that hurdle rate or that discount rate for the political risk, U.S. shale may be pretty competitive. So that would be another interesting area to explore.
Axel has a question.
One thing I don't know if we touched upon, but would running some of the oil companies as sunset industries, returning money to the shareholders, be a sensible strategy? And for which oil companies do you think that might be the case?
You're free to talk now.
I think number one is, I think the oil companies need to actually start thinking what they are today. They're trying to become integrated, they're trying to move into renewables. And the reality is you've got the old company and the new company is not going to generate free cash flow if it's investing in renewables. We don't see much free cash flow coming from renewables, we don't see much free cash flow or any free cash flow coming from US shale. this is where I'll then contradict your view on your shale's longevity. So I think there is an element that as they try to hedge themselves for the future, do you need to split those companies up into two different companies? One, which is not required to create cash flow, but is about reinvesting, more the sort of Google, Amazon type of model, versus the other one, which is of course what do we rely on? We rely on the cash flow. Now, the bigger question that brings, almost to your question is, what happens to the pension funds? Because practically all of them are relying on cash-free dividends. Who's paying the dividends? It's the traditional oil companies. And the biggest worry I have around both the global economy and the whole cycle breaking down is the one thing that the international oil companies do is they continue investing through the cycle. And they always go through this, oh woe, they're not making money when it's at the bottom of the cycle, and when it's at the top of the cycle, they make huge cash piles. Yeah? And that gets, they need to make the large capital reinvestment. So if that breaks down, not only has an impact on some of the financial markets and particularly the pension funds, but it also has an impact on this, where are the large capital projects, and I talk large, the multi-billion dollar projects, which can only be funded by those companies which get that very strong cash flow. So I don't see them sunsetting particularly, unless you really want to kill, and then you move into your very high oil price world, in which case US shale does survive. But if we stay in the low oil price world, which we should be, because you can develop plenty of oil below $40 a barrel, there's no shortage of less than $40 a barrel oil, then shale becomes the ceiling price and therefore doesn't grow, and I would agree with your outlook.
In terms of the sunset industry, first of all, I think that in this cycle, a bunch of companies are not investing the way they have in past cycles to maintain growth at the bottom. In fact, very few, probably Exxon and one or two others are. And if you're looking for an actual example of a sunset model, you can look at oil sands, right? My home country, right? Suncor, the second largest oil sands producer, said they're basically moving in that direction. Partially for political reasons, they want to say they're not going to invest until they build pipelines and so forth, but also just because that's what their investors want. And with the oil sands having a very low risk, no exploration, manufacturing type model, it's perfect for a sunset type model. So I think the investors, they're looking for that model. And of course, the analogy there is the tobacco industry, which is an uncomfortable analogy for a lot of people. That's where we look at oil sands.
Thank you. Anyone else have any more questions? Right here in front.
Hi, just a hypothetical question. Correct me if I'm wrong. It looks to me like most of these predictions are based on what we know today for the future, next 20 to 40 years. But if you look 20 years ago, nobody would have predicted that renewables would be where they are today. If you had asked anybody 20 years ago, probably would have expected less than half what we saw today. Don't you think that based on the pace of advancement of technology, and it's been really outstanding beyond any expectation, that the most optimistic curve may actually be the least probable to happen? It could be potentially something that we would exceed.
Thank you for the question. Although other gentlemen may have something to say, they pointed at me, so I have a privilege of answering. I agree with you that the pace of the development of the technology is enormous, but you also have to look at the needs for the infrastructure development, and especially in the developed economies, we already have all these infrastructure systems which are meant to be used in the old-fashioned technologies. So we foresee a lot of investment into that to take place, while our economies are kind of saturating in my own country, Japan especially. But on the other hand, developing countries, they benefit from leapfrogging, thanks to what you have mentioned as the advanced technology coming by much more quickly, faster pace, and then the cost reduction is very much faster. But at the same time, we are talking about the access to the energy and also the introducing the high-end technology at the same time. So for the government, it is a big question whether they can actually introduce both of them together at a high pace along with the pace of the technologies. So the problem is that we are not sure about the cost. You know, how much the budget they can actually supply to come up with the same pace with the advancement of the technology into the market for the developing world is a big question. If you imagine the advanced developed countries where all these technologies are becoming available, for example, like Norway, even Norway, they are very much the top runner in terms of introducing electric vehicles, but they are heavily subsidized. And then it was already mentioned that the renewable electricities, it has been very heavily subsidized, and now we are bumping into the kind of wall where we may have spent too much money investing on introducing renewables at a high pace, and then now we are trying to patch things up in terms of policy making or regulatory regulation. So we are actually in the middle of looking for a good solution because of the high pace of the advancement of the technology. I think institutions and then the government policy side are kind of trying to catch up with this space. So that will be one big question, I think.
And we are at 3:15, so you have 2 sentences.
Yeah,
Maybe 3.
Number one is short cycle capital costs is one of the reasons why renewables. That has been the trend, which has helped it to go, and low interest rates. So people are taking no rent. And Ernie Muniz talked about it this morning. He talked about zero marginal cost. You know, it's just not a sustainable model. I think that's the problem. We're going to get into a massive issue coming up, which is how does zero marginal cost work within a dispatch model for electricity. And if you just look at the cost of those short projects that have been done in wind and solar, they cost twice as much per dollar, twice as many dollars per megawatt as they do conventional, but they're being invested because of its short cycle. So I think there's still, we do still have to look at the underlying, facts and what has been driving it. In phenomenal growth, I think there are things we're missing. But I think there's a load of other things that we're also not talking about, like cobalt, like metals, like batteries, like intermittency.
Just a clarifying question. Per megawatt or per megawatt hour?
Per megawatt.
Thank you, everybody. Axel, do you want to close out? Yeah.
Thank you. Just regarding the technology, there are 3 types of technology progress. The autonomous technology progress, just because you have inventions and progress in other sectors that can spill over through oil, so this will happen anyway. And you have those are induced by price. So a high oil price might induce more technological progress for substitution on demand side. So we are back to the role of price and the question of will the prospect of a peak demand or event, possible event, what will be the impact on oil price volatility? Will it increase, decrease? That's you alluded to this question. And you have also the technological progress mandated by policies, induced by policy, and then we are back to the uncertainty regarding policy in the future.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Axel, Yamashita-san, Chris, RJ. This is really fantastic and touched on a lot of themes that have been brought up so far. Frank Fannin, Claudio Descalzi, and Musab El-Kabi will be next at 3:30 down in the main ballroom. And if you needed something more to bring you back tomorrow, the Khalid is not enough for you. We'll have a great presentation on carbon capture from a company called Net Power, which is using natural gas to produce power and capturing the carbon, which is a really great innovation. So tomorrow is going to be a great day as well. Please head on downstairs, and thank you all so much.